Hi there, this is Teresa Eicher with Counseling and Wellness Services of Archibald. We are in partnership with Jill Holgrave Wellness Consulting. So I wanted to take a little bit of time with you today to have some discussion about our brain and the fight, flight, freeze response in our brain. So there was a handout in your wellness slides this week, and I thought it did a really beautiful job of just addressing what some of the tools, skills you might need to move your body out of a fight, flight, freeze state. It talked about chronic stress, and it talked about how under chronic stress, we can move our body into a state where we kind of get stuck there, where we feel like we're perpetually in that space. So I just wanted to expand on that a little bit. I thought the tools were great that it gave. And so if you missed that handout, I might encourage you to go back to it. But I also wanted to take some time today and just talk a little bit about the brain and how the brain functions. And so in doing that, I think we first need to start with the idea that our brain has an emotional center to it. And so the emotional center to our brain is called the amygdala. And in the amygdala, it is responsible for processing, regulating emotion. It's also responsible for developing emotional memory and storing that. It stores it in long-term memory. And then it's also responsible for pleasure and for the fight, flight, freeze response or survival response. I think it's really, really important to understand that the responsibility of the amygdala is to help us and to help us to survive, essentially. It's instinctual, it's reactive, and it's kind of looking at the next 10 seconds to minute of our life. The intellectual part of our brain, the intellectual center, that is based in the prefrontal cortex. And when we think about the intellectual center of our brain, it's more responsible for things like, problem solving, taking facts and data and being able to weed through and identify what is important in the data that it's processing through. It's more responsible for planning. It looks more at the long term and can evaluate pros and cons and just filter through information. So we know that when a brain is balanced, meaning that it processes information well through the emotional center of the brain into the intellectual center, we are much better at getting balanced and rational points of views on situations in our life. But I think it's really important to understand that how the brain functions is that first, as information on situations comes into the brain, it's going to first process it through the emotional center of our brain. And that really kind of makes sense, right? Like the brain first needs to figure out, okay, is this something that I need to survive? Right? And so what it does is it takes the information that's come into the emotional center, it takes a look at it and it kind of matches it up with that emotional long-term memory. It just kind of says like, have I seen this before? Right? Is this something where in the past it's triggered a fight, flight, freeze response? It looks at that. Like it might look at themes of situations. It might also look at how our sensory system is responding. And so maybe that's a smell that we've smelled before and we need to move into survival. Maybe it's, something we've seen before or heard before. So we develop that memory in the emotional center based off of themes and events, but also through our sensory system. So once it processes through the sensory system, a decision is made. We either move it over to the intellectual side of our brain and into the intellectual center, or we move into fight, flight, freeze. And so our body moves us there and we treat it as if it's a survival response. The truth is that everyone has a tendency. Some people are fighters, some people freeze, some people run. And it really is just the body saying, okay, like I need to take care of you, and this is a dire situation. Um, if it moves it over into the intellectual center of our brain, then the intellectual center processes that and looks at it as more of, facts, information, looks at it from a problem solving point of view, looks at pros and cons, what that means for the long term. But the goal of that is that as it's processed through both areas, we are able to have a balanced, rational perspective on whatever that situation might be. So, if we think about that and we think about enduring enough chronic stress in our day to day, that our body is in a perpetual state of fight, flight, freeze, our body is perpetually surviving, you know, I can only imagine how that then might impact your perception of the day to day. We're probably not factoring in all the information that we need to because our body is just in a state where it's like, hey, I don't know what's coming next. I need to react. I need to, get done with this as quickly as possible. So that's probably then going to really impact relationships, whether that's family, friends, coworkers, just people in the community that you encounter. That's also really then going to impact how we perceive ourselves and how we experience ourselves, understanding what our needs are, honoring kind of where we're at in situations. So, if any of this rings true for you, if you can really relate to the handout or anything that I'm sharing here, I'm just going to really encourage you to seriously take a look at some of those tips and tools and skills that the handout talks about. And really just consider, like, how do I calm myself down in the day to day? Sometimes that's boundary setting. Sometimes that's removing ourselves from hard situations. Sometimes that's being intentional about getting out into nature and engaging in movement. Sometimes it's something as simple as the breath. Believe it or not, managing our breath and just taking deep breaths from our gut really is something that triggers the brain to calm down. And it also initiates a physiological response in your body to calm down. So, just kind of looking at, okay, what do I need to consider here and what can I be mindful of, and just make a pivot and start a new habit. Okay, I hope this finds you well, and I will be back again next week.